Hello, I'm Finlo Costain, the editor-in-chief of 8.9 Hectares. Welcome to this week's discussion. Analysis by the Global Alliance for the Future of Food and Dalberg Advisors finds that food systems account for at least 15% of the fossil fuels used annually. This report is the first time that researchers have focused on fossil fuels rather than simply emissions and estimated their global use across the entire food system. To discuss the report and some of the issues it raises, I'm joined by report author Patty Fong from the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, by Sue Pritchard, the Chief Executive of the UK's Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, and by Karl Williams, a Director of Food Systems Consultancy, FAI Farms. Patty, let me come to you first. Most people want to talk about emissions, especially in the run-up to COP28. Why are you shining the light specifically onto fossil fuel use?
Thanks, Finlo. So over the past couple of decades, we've had strategies to reverse climate change by focusing on decarbonizing the most energy-intensive or most emissions-intensive sectors. 3/4 of our global emissions comes from energy use for electricity, for heating, and for transport. And these strategies are working, but if we don't get a global commitment to phase out of fossil fuels and address emissions in our food systems, we're not going to achieve our target and stay below 1.5 degrees. So, but these can't be siloed approaches, right? You can't work on energy on one end and food on the other. So we entered into this research to understand, well, actually, how are these two sectors intertwined? And we asked the question, how can we support philanthropy, policymakers, and climate advocates explore a more coordinated approach to food systems transformation?
Thank you. Sue, why is a focus on fossil fuels welcome from your perspective?
Well, we've said for a long time that the diet we're eating at the moment is basically fossil fuels on a plate. And that's very often hidden to most citizens. We end up focusing on quite reductive things like a bit of consumer choice here or a bit of behaviour change there. This report is a really welcome contribution to us being able to think much more widely and much more systematically about all of the component parts of our current food system and where we need to act to get most benefit.
Do you think that that sort of singular approach around fossil fuels makes it easier to visualise, makes the narrative easier, more straightforward for policymakers and for customers, consumers? Sue?
I think when you talk about food, everybody can relate to that. We all, hopefully, eat food up to 3 times a day. And so it's a route in to talking about much more complex issues that can sometimes feel very distant and abstracted for us. So when you have that kind of data related to the food on your plate, it makes the system much clearer, much cleaner for people to understand.
Thank you. Karl, you've criticised a straightforward focus on emissions, which we know can be distorting, particularly around ruminant methane, for example. So are you pleased to see this shift in attention towards fossil fuels in food systems?
Yeah, I think in terms of sort of, where we started, and as you say, Finlo, I think the big focus on emissions, I think, did no favours to the ruminant sector at all. And certainly, we've got an organic pasture for life system at FAI, and methane is probably our biggest emissions factor when you start looking at some of this. So again, I think looking through a different lens and having a different set of data and metrics that we can look at some of these challenges, as opposed to just a single metric around methane, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, I think is a really good is a really good perspective to start coming from. And I was really interested to sort of read through the report in terms of sort of that allocation to farming. It surprised me the amount that of the emissions that sort of sit in food processing and that sort of consumer facing element. I think we've got obviously some big opportunities to look at, but I think it broadens the debate out a little bit, as opposed to getting stuck on 1 or 2 emissions factors that will mean that we end up and I suppose as governments are starting to talk about reducing livestock numbers in terms of certainly in terms of ruminants, but is not going to deal with the issues that this report raises.
It's interesting, isn't it, to have that that attention drawn back to fossil fuels, which is, of course, what we were talking about, 20, 30 years when we were first discussing climate change. And there is a big difference between fossil methane and naturally cycling methane. And there's still an awful lot that we need to understand about how that cycling methane operates in grass-based systems, how it actually fuels grass-based systems and assists soil health as well, Karl.
Yeah, I think the research that we've done on our farm on the outskirts of Oxford, we're 1,300 acres, predominantly ruminant cattle systems. We've been going through a 4-year sort of regenerative grazing project that's been sponsored by McDonald's UK, and I think what we've seen is definitely an increase in carbon sequestration on the farm. So I know our carbon stocks are increasing. Biodiversity has been a massive increase that we've seen on farms. So again, these systems are sort of more holistic in their approach, to dealing with some of these issues. We use a minimum amount of fossil fuels. We're organic, so there's no fertilizers or agrochemicals used on the farm. It's pretty much sort of the guys driving around on a quad bike. So and in terms of our emissions, as you say, Finlo, there's only one place that those emissions are coming from, which is our grassland pulling that out of the atmosphere. So it's quite a circular system.
Interesting. Of course, that quad bike, I don't know whether it is, but it could be an electric quad bike, and we'll come on to energy a little bit later. Just finally, Karl, before I go back to the others, the report does say that 15% of global fossil fuel use is down to food systems. Is that figure a surprise to you?
I suppose reading the report, it did surprise me in terms of the amount of fossil fuels that we are, because I think again when you look at some of the the data, certainly things like world in data where 75% of our emissions are associated to fossil fuels. I think them pulling that details out in terms of what agriculture or the food supply chain is pulling from that system is, I suppose, is quite it's quite a concern that we're at that sort of level, and again, without knowing that the opportunities to reduce that, certainly from I think there's bigger opportunities within that supply chain. Certainly feel that there's big opportunities for government to support some of these initiatives, certainly at farm level, and which I think is more carrot. I think we need a little bit more carrot from the government. I think maybe a little bit more stick on the supply chain. But then I would say that being a farmer, so.
So where do you think the largest fossil fuel reductions can be made fastest within the food system?
I think the report gives us a very clear steer. I think clearly there are things that we can do on farm, and we just heard those really clearly. But such a significant proportion of fossil fuel use in processed foods and ultra processed foods, the stuff that ends up on our plates, was a surprise to me. That was really interesting and significant. So I think we're probably pretty well rehearsed now on the sorts of things that we can do on farm, but it very clearly directs our attention to thinking hard about what processors and retailers are doing with the commodities they're buying and turning into food for our plate. So I think that's the area that we can start looking really, really hard at, and we can go on to talk about that, or I can pile straight into it.
Let's come back to UPFs in just a moment, but I think you're right. I think it's really interesting that we have, of course, spent a lot of time focusing on the farm system, the farm element of food systems. And so having this light shone onto these sort of cogs further up the chain, looking at the way that things are processed, the way that that food is retailed is very important. Patty, do you think that it's possible to make big reductions in just one area of the food system, or do we need that sort of whole food system approach that Sue very often talks about in order to eliminate the use of fossil fuels?
I think you might guess my answer. We always talk about a whole of food systems approach. So you can't, if you just pull on one lever, you're going to have an effect on another part of the system. So you need to, one, phase out of fossil fuel from food systems by tackling things like fossil fuel-based pesticides, fertilizers, plastics, and packaging. At the same time, you have to invest in scaling up on regenerative farming and agroecology. You have to invest in scaling up renewable energy across the supply chain, for cold chain, for processing, for transport. And then you have to, support eating more locally produced, seasonal, minimally processed foods.
Patty, we've talked a little bit, or we've touched on energy, but let's sort of set this part of the conversation up a little bit more. Energy is a key focus in the report. Fuel energy for power, chemical energy for growing crops. Why are food systems such intensive energy users? And what can be done to address the energy element?
Let me specify that it's not all food systems, it's especially industrialized food systems. And they're not only energy intensive, but this trend is growing, and this trend is due to increased mechanization on farms. So larger farm tracts, you need more machinery on the farms, and the growing use of fertilizers and other fossil-based inputs. The International Energy Agency, the Food and Agriculture Organization are both projecting this increased use going forward on all these external inputs. And then you have this increasingly globalized supply chains. You have growing demand for meat, dairy, and ultra-processed foods. And then you also have, to some extent, some of the new food trends, such as alternative proteins.
Indeed. And something that's less well known, perhaps, is that lab-produced protein requires a phenomenal amount of energy to produce it. We're perhaps used to the idea that industrialized agriculture is a high energy user, but we often think of lab protein as a climate solution. But bearing in mind the energy use that is required to produce that sort of food at scale, do you think that it can play a substantial role in the future of food? Or should we simply be turning back to that greater diversity of whole foods and seasonal foods?
Well, so those that are working on lab-produced protein, they acknowledge that that it's very energy intensive, and they're betting on the decarbonization of the energy system to make it successful. And those of us that are working on energy system decarbonization and the accelerate uptake of renewable energy know that it's not just about replacing one source of energy with another, right? So to actually have a decarbonized energy system, it requires fundamental changes. Just like in food, it also needs to take place in energy. You need to address grid and storage infrastructure, but in order for it to have a stable system, you need to reduce demand overall for energy. And we have to shift how and when we use the energy. So we need to reduce demand for energy across all sectors, not just for food systems, in order to support a fully decarbonized energy system. And we can contribute this by diversifying our diets away from the extractive, energy-intensive commodities and towards more locally produced, seasonal, and traditional foods.
Sue, I want to come and ask you about UPFs, but first of all, Patty mentioned there the drive from the FAO to produce ever more food, and there is this sort of idea that we need to, almost double food production by 2050. Do you think that we need to increase food production, or is it about managing food better?
I think this is a really, really important question. We already produce more than enough food for 9 billion people on the planet. It's just inequitably distributed and profligately wasted. Producing ever more food raises all the sorts of questions that Patty's just described there. More energy use, more packaging, more transport, more logistics, more. I think there's a really important conversation for us to start having about what is enough, what is sufficient to meet our needs in a more balanced, a more fair, a more equitable, a more sustainable food system that starts to kind of push back at the increased consolidation and financialization of the food system, by which I mean the number of companies who are trying to extract some value. They often call it adding value. It's clearly depleting value from the quality of the food that we eat. Because, of course, as we said right at the start, we all need food. We're all going to continue to need food. That is going to be, that is, undeniable. And so leaning into that question, to what extent should we be thinking about a sufficiency of food, a good enough sufficiency of food that meets everybody's needs on the planet, and those of us in the global north who are consuming far too much food, wasting far too much food, getting perhaps overexcited about novel foods, novel but deeply unhealthy foods, have to take a long, hard look at the direction of travel that that's taking us in and how we can step back from that.
So one of the key culprits that we've started to talk about in terms of energy use is that ultra-processed food. And first of all, what do we mean by ultra-processed foods? Because it's increasingly talked about within the policy community. But what's the definition? For example, are cheese and bread processed or ultra-processed? What is the difference?
Depends which cheese and it depends which bread. So ultra-processed foods is a category of foods. It is a controversial definition, but full disclosure, I think it is good enough for us to work with for now. But essentially, it describes foods that are kind of industrial formulations of food products. They're typically mass-produced. They use ingredients that you won't find in your kitchen and that you couldn't replicate in your kitchen. So they use all sorts of perhaps industrially derived ingredients like protein isolates and all sorts of additional chemicals. And the research is starting to indicate, although it's still early days, that it's not just the ingredients in these foods that are problematic. They're typically high fat, high sugar, high salt. And all of these additional chemicals, but it's the method of processing that is having a serious impact on our health and well-being. So it's still quite controversial, but I, along with lots of other people who are particularly focused on food and health, think that these are very much good enough definitions where we should be starting to apply the precautionary principle much more seriously in thinking about the kinds of foods on the shelves and on our plates.
I don't want to put you on the spot with something that's potentially, quite a technical question, but when you talk about the type of processing, are you able to unpack that at all?
Well, it's the sort of processing that's going on in big factories where you can imagine the kind of extrusion and the additives of chemicals that you just simply can't replicate. And it's the combination of chemicals that are required in those foods and as I say, the methods of production in combining those chemicals and creating those chemicals that are now, it seems, contributing to increased ill health and poorer well-being, poor mental health too. So it moves us away very much from thinking about kind of calories and ingredients, but it also invites us to think about the methods of production of those foods. It is under-researched, but there are lots of really high quality research teams now starting to look much more closely at the implications of this.
So when we're talking about fossil fuels in the food system, we've largely been talking about the energy that's going into the food system, where that comes from. And now we're starting focusing on processed and ultra-processed foods. And that requires a more of a societal shift. And partly it requires that we understand some of the social impacts associated with UPFs so that makes them less desirable, perhaps to policymakers as well as to customers. So how do you get a sense of how we reduce their prevalence in society, Sue?
Well, I think we just have to not make them. We have to not make them. We need to be looking
but very. Don't people want them?
Well, I think this is a huge topic that needs perhaps a whole other program of its own, and we can talk about the work we've been doing with citizens in our citizen engagement program. But first of all, let's start from people wanting those products. Businesses often argue that they wouldn't make them if people didn't buy them, and they're only responding to customer demand. But that's simply not how it works, is it? Those big businesses are spending millions and millions of pounds in their R&D kitchens formulating products and then persuading people to buy them. We're not really sitting around thinking, what I really, really want is, I don't know, let's say Kit Kat in a breakfast cereal. I don't think many people were sitting around requesting that. And yet one major food business decided that would be a good product to sell and market so they could broaden their market share in the cereal market. If you take a photo of the cereals in a supermarket aisle, you will see banks and banks and banks of really unhealthy products that are being marketed to children. They're high in sugar and they're often ultra processed. So it's not so much that consumers are asking for them, it's businesses are formulating them. Now, in exactly the same way that we're making the case, I think collectively, that fossil fuel companies have to stop producing fossil fuels, we have to start making the case and looking to the big food processing businesses to really reduce their portfolio of ultra processed foods in a systematic and speedy way. It's not just the product, it's the plastics, it's the packaging, it's the chemical cocktail that adds up inside those products. If we're not making it, we're not using the commodity either in the first place. We're not wasting land producing the commodity that's needed for that really healthy food. So back to taking a whole systems view of what there is in our plate, we can track back, can't we, the energy use, the nutrient profile, the health benefits, the waste that is all associated with the prevalence of ultra-processed foods. And now in the UK, they're making up 65% of our diets, with huge implications for our health and well-being.
Thank you. Karl, although the focus on fossil fuels potentially helps to correct distortions around animal products created by an emissions-only lens, there are still meats that are more ecologically sustainable or unsustainable than others, aren't there?
Yeah, I think, yeah, and I suppose going back to your point, on this sort of emissions-focused lens that we've had, and obviously with ruminant production really sort of coming under some, I would say unfair and maybe fair criticism in some quarters. I think, when you look at our land mass globally, and it depends how you want to define a grassland, but it's 20 to 40% of our global land mass is under grassland. The only thing that can convert that into human edible protein is ruminants, and I think they play an incredibly important part in that ecosystem, that biodiversity. And again, it's how we manage those systems. That those systems went on for millennia. You've got obviously the savannah, wildebeest moving across them. That system was working perfectly well. And again, that's what we're trying to sort of replicate to a degree at FAI with the understanding and knowledge that we've got. And again, these systems, we can produce, high quality food, and again, this goes back to, some of the things that Sue's saying in terms of, high nutrient density. Again, I think, you look at some of the research around, a carrot now versus something that was produced 20, 25 years ago. The macro and micronutrients are completely different, same with apples, same with a lot of our fruits. I think, and again, it's really difficult for farming. We're being sold, this is the next seed, this is the next product in terms of, this is what the consumer's demanding. A lot of farmers that I speak to, in terms of a lot of this, feel that they have an obligation to feed the world. If you're 200 acres in the UK, as I point out, you are definitely not feeding the world from your farm. I think, you are producing food, and how we do that, I think it certainly needs a root and branch change in terms of everything. I think I read in the paper the other day that on one of the morning programs they had their celebrity chef making mashed potato, and you sort of think, when we're at a point that we're having to teach people to make mashed potato, you sort of think, there needs to be a wholesale change in everything that we do. This needs, we need to be in schools teaching children about food production, local production, all the benefits that brings. We need to engage with that consumer differently. And again, I think the opportunities that then starts providing for farming and agriculture, because we have massive opportunities in reversing some of the challenges that we've seen, which again is why we focus so much on regenerative agriculture at the farm at FAI.
Interesting. I think one of the things I'm taking away from this conversation, that the three big things that we need to really focus on are the feed that goes into animals that are used for animal products, that we need to focus on things like fertilizers and the amount of processing that happens. And so those three things to start with would potentially create an enormous change. Now, Patty, we focus so far on food systems as energy users, but as you point out in your report, food systems are also energy producers. Farmland can be used to produce solar energy and biofuel. Crops, farms, factories and restaurants can produce energy from waste. Could you take us through this area in just a bit more detail?
Sure. So indeed, producing energy from land can provide also, as a positive benefit, additional source of income for farmers. But it can also negatively impact the environment and local communities. So, for example, as you mentioned, producing crops for fuel takes away land for actual food production, for actual direct human consumption, which then can contribute to increasing food costs, contribute to water and air pollution, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, there was one study that said that producing ethanol from corn is actually worse for the climate than gasoline. The subsidies for biogas production also incentivize the growth of industrialized livestock industry. These are like the feedlot cattle, should we be, something that's good for climate is actually not good when we talk about the bigger food systems and kind of the industrial livestock industry. And also, these types of subsidies can also incentivize deforestation. So another study found that the European Union's palm biodiesel policy actually caused the loss of tropical forests the size of the Netherlands.
So there's a degree to which this conversation links to your work on a land use framework. And I wonder how you think we can square the circle in terms of land management and what forms of energy land should be producing.
So our land use framework centres on the notion of multifunctionality and diversity across the whole of the landscape. So instead of trying to segment land into separate functions, we think about how we can do more than one thing on the land that we have available. Now, in energy terms, there's lots we can do in the urban environment, using solar on houses, insulating houses so they use less energy in the first place, using solar on car parks, on the kind of grey land that is just used for very little other than things like out of town superstore car parking, for example. When we think about the farm landscape, and if we think more creatively about multifunctionality, how many things we can do on any one piece of land, it's not impossible at all to combine well-designed solar panels with growing underneath. And there's some lovely examples that farmers are already deploying, combining free-range chickens with solar panels, or sheep, or horticulture with solar panels. So we start thinking in terms of multifunctionality and meeting a range of needs at once, instead of, as Patty just said, concentrating only on climate. But if we think in terms of action on climate, restoring biodiversity and nature, thinking about health and well-being, and thinking about a fairer and more sustainable food system, then it leads us to make some different, more imaginative, more creative choices.
And presumably within that, there are things that probably we shouldn't be growing and using farmland for. And I'm guessing that biofuels sort of comes within that.
Absolutely. I mean, first priority for land should be food for humans. And then food for animals, should that be needed. But as Phil was saying just there, let's concentrate on ruminants. Let's concentrate on livestock that can do well on grasslands, and not think about having to feed livestock from the land take. But yeah, absolutely. Let's prioritise land and landscape for growing food for humans, for carbon sequestration, for nature recovery, for tree planting, hedgerows, green infrastructure. There's a neat taxonomy of priorities in our land use framework.
And then potentially stack or integrate those sort of energy production things like wind turbines and solar farms where possible within that. Interesting.
Yes.
Karl, just finally, large companies, I say finally, but it's quite a big question. Large companies have become increasingly focused on reducing both their own internal and production emissions, scope 1 and scope 2, and on supply chain emissions, scope 3. Do you think that a stronger focus on fossil fuels rather than simply emissions, the cause rather than the symptom, will help to accelerate delivery of those scope 3 emissions in particular?
Yeah, I think yeah, and I mean, obviously, we were involved in some of this work, through our consultancy business. So, and it's very clear, I suppose, when companies have made these commitments, they probably haven't quite grasped the complexity of what they've signed up to. I think, as you say, ffinlo, those scope 3 emissions at farm level are going to be a massive challenge, for that food supply chain to deal with, because most of those supply chains don't really have a relationship with those farmers. So maybe, the scope 1, 2, which is within their remit, to be able to sort of focus on, because again, as that report said, 80% of that, fossil fuel use is within that sector. So, maybe the opportunity to change that, but I think it's a wholesale change across that whole sector. How we produce food at farm level, how we process it, how we package it and sell it to the consumer. I think it needs to be changed, and it's really difficult. It's really this is like we've got a super tanker, and how do we turn it and how do we stop it? Because it's very, very difficult.
And my hope is that, through this fossil fuel lens, it'll help people who are higher up in those supply chains and perhaps have less of an understanding about what happens on farm, visualize, those areas that they can really start to make a difference in terms of those scope 3 emissions, which again comes back to the type of feed that's being used, the types of fertilizers, the energy that's actually being used on farm. Well, that's where we're going to have to leave it. I'd like to thank my guests, Karl Williams, Sue Pritchard and Patty Fong. That's it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed the programme. More news on our website, 8point9.com. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.